Good morning, church family. So good to worship together and to bring ourselves into God's presence this way. I want to invite you to turn with the Bible to John chapter 6, and we'll make that our focus. In fact, I want to start a series of messages on Jesus' statements in the Gospel of John. They're all found there. The great I am is Jesus Christ. Do you know that? You remember where I am came from in the Old Testament, where Moses was standing before this burning bush, and God was calling him to do something he didn't want to do, didn't feel like he could do. And Moses says, well, the Egyptians aren't going to believe me, so who should I say sent me? And God says, I am. It's kind of a non-answer, isn't it? I mean, I am who I am. You just need to go. You're going to find out as you journey with me. Jesus offers these statements in John to help us understand his true identity and who Jesus is and what he came to do. And I can't think of a better focus for us. We are only 5 or so weeks from Easter Sunday. We're approaching April the 4th. Quickly, that is for us as a church, a time to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And thank you, Jacob, for calling out the fact that we are in a different season, a season of Lent. This is the first time I've ever heard a youth pastor quote the Pope, and I'm appreciative of that. Now, for those of you in the fellowship hall and you didn't hear Jacob's prayer, now you're definitely going to go back on Facebook and hear that. But what he said is so important, that this is a season of humbling ourselves, and yet it's a season of hope as well. Hope is something that's always in front of us. We're thinking about the fact that Christ is risen, and during the season of Lent, we're wanting to consider who Jesus is. We're wanting to consider what he came here to do as he was born in Bethlehem. We celebrate at Christmas. And as we journey toward the cross, as we've been thinking about that. The first I am statement that I want to cover is Jesus saying to us, I am the bread of life. The only one that satisfies the deepest hunger of our soul, the only one that can satisfy our need for salvation. Jesus came to bring us those things. He came to bring us life and life abundantly. What you may not know about the I am statements through the Gospel of John is that the Gospel of John is written very poetically. It's arranged in a certain way, very intelligently. And these 7 I am statements, which are unique to the Gospel of John, each one of those I am statements is actually tied to one of Jesus' miracles. And John uses the I am statements to help us understand who Jesus is. We know why John wrote his gospel. He says, I write these things to you that you may believe. And that's what he's after. So with all of these I am statements, I want you to tune into that and to think about that Jesus came that we may believe. And by believing in him, we may have life. That's what the Gospel of John is all about. It's what the good news of Jesus Christ is all about. And I invite you to walk with me in the next several weeks as we think about these I am statements and what they're about. Would you stand with me as you're able? I'm reading from John chapter 6, and what has just happened ahead of verse 25, I'll start with verse 25. What's happened just ahead of that, of course, is that Jesus has fed the 5,000. Now, of course, it was more than 5,000. In those times, they counted the men, the heads of households. So we know there were many more than 5,000. Jesus took loaves and fishes, just a few of them, and distributed them among the masses, this miraculous sign. And so, man, what would happen if somebody did something like that so publicly? You know people would be looking for him. So the next day, they catch up to him again. And now you have Jesus saying what that miracle was all about. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked Jesus, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus answered, very truly, I tell you, you're looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Isn't that great? They're hungry again. Do not work for food that spoils, but for bread that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him, God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Then they asked him, what must we do to do the works that God requires? And Jesus answered, the work of God is this, here it is, to believe. The work of God is to do this, to believe in the one he has sent. So they asked him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute. Didn't they just see a sign? Isn't it true that even all of Jesus' miracles are somewhat temporary in nature because people see it and they still don't believe? What will you do? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it's written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Remember that? They got bread every day. So Jesus, what are you going to do next? Because we're hungry again. And Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life into the world. Sir, he said, always give us this bread. And Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you've seen me, and still you do not believe. Has God done something in your life that makes you know that he's true, and yet you still struggle to follow him or to believe? All those the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all that he has given me, but raise them up on the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him, shall have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. May God bless the reading of his word. You can be seated. Well, Lent is upon us, and it's typically a season of doing without something that we prefer or that we like. Of course, it's always good to do away with something that's outright sinful or rebellious, but that's not really the spirit of what Lent is. Lent is a time of doing without something that we know in our human desires we want. We recognize we don't need. So a couple of years ago, I gave up coffee, and this year I've given up, made a commitment, something similar. But a couple of years ago, I gave up coffee, and I was talking to our men's breakfast about how much I wanted coffee because all of them were drinking coffee in front of me. And in that way, it was actually very effective to me. I know that Lent is not a biblical requirement, et cetera, I get it. But to me, it's been useful because it helps me to realize there are so many things on this planet that I'm really comfortable with and that I get cranky if it's taken away. Now, we've all had lots of things taken away from us, as was mentioned during this service, and this has been a time of intense crankiness, for sure. But I think as believers in Christ, what we want to do is focus ahead on our hope that is in Jesus. And friends, what is it that you tend to look to for your sense of well-being and comfort that isn't Christ? That's a challenging thing to be confronted with in our flesh, in our humanness, because even though we have Christ living in us, we still live in these jars of clay, and man, it's hard sometimes to do without. And then I do have a very dear Catholic friend who told me, well, you do realize, Ken, that when you practice Lent, you can observe or take back the thing you gave up on Sundays during Lent. And believe me, I thought she was kidding. You can tell. I'm a Quaker. I've never grown up with these kind of things. I had no idea. But she's right. Isn't that cool? April, I Googled you, just so you knew. I mean, I totally trusted you, but I Googled you at the same time. And I thought, this is a victory. This is awesome. And it's actually a helpful reminder. We are celebrating today the fact that Christ is already risen. Now, that's Quaker. Christ is already risen, and he's already present with us. So, friends, don't be legalistic. But I want to invite you to think with me a little bit as we kick off, for me anyways, a series. I want to invite you to think with me about your own soul and the hunger of your soul? And what are you doing to reach out for that emptiness that we all feel in this world, this longing we have for something eternal, even though we're just living in the here and now? Let me begin with this question, and as you think about your own condition and what your soul hungers for, why are we unsatisfied? And I want to start with that question. Notice verse 26 of what we just read. Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, you're looking for me, but you're not looking because you saw the signs I performed." And in John, the word signs is always used for miracles. Have you ever noticed that? He didn't call them miracles, he calls them signs. It's a different word in the original language. It's because the miracles point to something. Jesus doesn't just do something flashy so that we'll say, wow, that's really cool. They're always a sign pointing to something. And the sign, in this case, of the bread being multiplied like that, I mean, that's pretty cool, is pointing to Jesus as the bread of life. You're not there spiritually. But because you ate the loaves and had your fill, it's really challenging to us to think about what Jesus is saying there. He's saying, you're more interested in what I can give you than in me. Does that make sense? So a reason that I think we're unsatisfied is we seek satisfaction in the gifts of God and not in God himself. Isn't that true? We all want the things that God will give us. Why? Because we're human. We all crave those things in our weakness. Think with me this Lent season about how totally dependent we are upon God for everything. The gifts of God, I'm intentional to call them that in this outline. I'm not talking about the bad things of the world that we're addicted to. I'm talking about the good gifts of God that sustain us day to day. That's what bread is. Bread and water are seen as the essentials for life, whether or not that follows with really modern science in terms of what our body needs the most, or gluten or whatever else. We just need to understand it in Jesus' context, that bread and water, the living water and the bread of life, are our sustenance. They are daily what we need. We can't do without food. We're all addicted to food. Is that accurate to say? We're all addicted to certain types of food, I'm sure. But that's not a bad addiction. It's a gift of God. It's something that God gives us. But to what extent are we looking to the gifts of God to where we actively go find him on the other side of Lake Gennesaret? As we circle around, as Jesus dodges them. He isn't interested in the crowds. He's interested in the disciples. He isn't interested in those that are just impressed and want something from him that won't last long. That's not the point of getting to know Jesus. And there's lots of other preachers out there that will say that. If you follow Jesus, you're going to be healthy and wealthy and wise. And Jesus seems to dodge that kind of notoriety. You're only here because your bellies are empty again. Do we worship the gifts of God, or do we worship God himself? And Jesus is drawing a distinction, and he wants us to understand that. It's something that we can relate to because we all need bread or food in our belly. Just as some examples. Why don't we find satisfaction? Because we look at it, we look for it in different places. And I'm just going to call on some wisdom from the Old Testament here. We don't find lasting satisfaction in pleasure. Are you with me? Do you find satisfaction in pleasure? Absolutely. I think it's a gift of God. It's something God invented and God created. It's not about making ourselves intentionally in pain just to put ourselves in pain and to prove that we can do that and we're more holy than somebody else because we can deprive ourselves in this, that, or the other thing, or we don't indulge in certain things. It's not the point. But we don't find lasting satisfaction, for example, in pleasure. So Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes, no matter how much we see, we're never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we're never content. You know, Solomon should know. In the Old Testament, things were very different. Are you with me? These are the parts of the stories of the Old Testament we don't put on the flannel graphs. Solomon had 700 wives. You remember that? Or was it 300 wives, 700 concubines? I think I'm right. 300 concubines. It was a lot. Calvin Miller wrote a children's story called Solomon's Sore Lips. I love that. And it talks about how difficult it was to kiss each one of his brides goodnight. It's a crazy kid story. Pleasure. If anybody would know, it's Solomon. You're not going to find the lasting pleasure, the kind of life that Jesus longs to bring, in pleasure. Will it give you satisfaction and a needed rest, and is it a gift of God to take a vacation? Sure. But are you living for that? Jesus says, watch out. Your soul's going to stay hungry. We don't find lasting satisfaction in performance. I think this is the second thing that in our culture we're very addicted to. You know, it's almost a badge of honor when somebody asks you about your day and you respond this way, well, I'm busy. It's like a badge. I'm busy. That means I'm really important. So I have lots to do. I'm important. And you never see Jesus with that pace or franticness about his life. He's just here to save the whole world for all time. He's just here to carry the whole burden of sin on his shoulders. And he does it without hurrying. I love that about Jesus. We're not going to find our sense of life that Jesus longs to bring, whatever it means that Jesus is the bread of life, we're not going to find that by eating this bread of I'm needed. I'm valuable because of what I do, my performance, if you will. There was a man all alone, Solomon wrote. He had neither son nor brother. And by the way, this is what we really are made for, is relationship. I say that all the time. But that's why God made us. It's for relationship. It's not for doing stuff. It's not for pleasure, etc. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother, relationship. There was no end to his toil, his work, his performance. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked. And why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too, Solomon says, is meaningless. It's the word that goes throughout the wisdom of Ecclesiastes. A miserable business. Isn't that encouraging as you think about going back to work tomorrow morning? It's meaningless. It's pointless compared to your relationship with Jesus. Think about that. And what is it that we're looking for to fill that emptiness and that void in our soul? We also don't find the bread of life. We don't find lasting satisfaction in our possessions. Clear enough? I mean, believe it or not, winning the lottery isn't going to solve your life. You know, there's some studies out there about lottery winners that say, by and large, lottery winners are not prepared for wealth. And they lose it within a few years. You don't believe me? We had a gal purchase 2 homes in our subdivision 20 years ago, right at the time we were building our house in there. And she moved her family in, and she moved in across the way. And they only ended up living there maybe 10 years. They had to sell one of the houses because they went broke. She had won the Washington lottery. And instead of taking the $8 million over time, she took $1.5 million after taxes all at once. You know what I'm saying? We're just, okay. All that I'm saying is, winning the lottery is not the answer to your life problems. Now, I'm really inviting you to think about that. Because we can say that we believe that, but then we think, oh man, if I won the lottery, right? Surely I'd be happy. Surely I'd be content. Surely I'd be joyful. We don't find lasting satisfaction even in our possessions. Am I saying that possessions are evil? No. I'm talking about the good gifts of God. But when we look to the gifts of God and not God himself and relationship with him, we've missed the point. When we follow Jesus around the lake just because we want more stuff from him, we're going to be disappointed. Let me offer then, first, let me ask you a question. What if everything in your life that you needed was already right in front of you? What if?
Hi.
Hi.
I was marooned on an island for 5 years with this package. I swore that I would deliver it to you because I work for FedEx.
That's very admirable. Thank you.
Hey, but by the way, what's in the package?
Nothing really. Just a satellite phone, GPS locator, fishing rod, water purifier, and some seeds. Just silly stuff. Thank you again. You keep up the good work.
Love that commercial. What if everything that we needed was already right in front of us? You know, to be marooned on a desert island, by the way, would be incredibly humbling, don't you think? You think about not just the deprival of not having food, but I watched this show. I've binge watched this show, not because I'm looking for the bread of life in binge watching shows, but I watched this show called Alone, and they put these people out there all by themselves to survive. And the number one reason people tap out because they don't make it, they just can't handle it, isn't because they're hungry or injured or whatever else. That happens too. They tap out because they're lonely. What if God had already given you what you need to be satisfied, but we overlook it? And by the way, we have 2 FedEx workers in the sanctuary. They're like this. And actually, it made me think that our delivery people have been essential workers during the pandemic. Thank you for serving us that way. Who knew that delivery would become such an important thing? The other thing about the pandemic is it does show us we need relationship, doesn't it? I mean, if you were stuck on an island, you might take a volleyball and name him Wilson and paint a hand, a face on Wilson. But it's true, isn't it? We're made for so much more than the stuff of life. We're made for so much more. And when we do without those things for any amount of time, we begin to realize that. And how we've missed the fellowship of others in gatherings. Do you know why? It's because God made us to need each other. We need each other. Ready? Dave offered to set that to me earlier, but I didn't want to spike it. I wouldn't be able to help myself, so it's good. It's good that he didn't set that in my direction. Satisfying our true hunger. Let me make some comments about maybe what that looks like as we consider that Jesus is the bread of life. I want to say this from the passage. Please notice verse 28 and 29. They asked him, "What must we do to do the works God requires?" And Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he sent." There's something going on here that I just want you to notice, and that is that the people who followed Jesus around the lake looking for him to fill their bellies again, even though Jesus has started to tell them what really satisfies and who he really is and what this sign is pointing to, they still don't get it, and they ask the wrong question. It sounds like this: "What must we do?" And Jesus corrects it. And he says, it's not about what you do, it's about what you believe. You get it? They're always looking for what they can do. Do you realize that this is the separation of Christianity and every other religion in the world? Every other religion in the world goes something like this. A holy God is one that you have to aspire or reach up to and be good enough. Christianity is so different. It's about the bread of heaven, the manna from heaven, coming down. And I tried to emphasize that word down every time it came across in John 6, and there are more references to coming down from heaven that I didn't mention. But the manna comes down from heaven, and as we die with Jesus, as we give ourselves selflessly to him, so unappealing to our flesh, as we give ourselves to him, he raises us up. That's totally opposite of the other religions of the world. Do you get it? It's not about us being good enough or doing something to get this bread that we so need. It's about us humbling ourselves. True hunger, satisfying our true hunger, begins with humility. I was thinking about this earlier this week, about bread specifically, and why does Jesus use bread, and why does he use water? when he's describing who he is to us and what he came to bring us? Well, one of the things I thought about, does this sound crazy to you, is that if you think of it, anytime you eat, that's an act of humility. Now, let me explain that. What do you mean it's humble to eat? It means that your body needs more energy. You can't do without it. Every time you eat, you're doing something that God does not need to do. God, the eternal creator of everything, he made everything out of nothing, doesn't need to renew his energy. Never sleeps. Doesn't have any need for that. To eat, for us, is to admit our fallenness, our frailty. Man, I got to eat pretty often. Have you ever thought about that as a dependency thing? Other generations certainly have, as they have wondered where the next meal would come from and the next meal would come from. To eat is an act of dependency, and it's no wonder why for generations and traditions people have prayed as they go to eat. It's a gift from God. It's a way of identifying, I don't have any right to this necessarily, and I need this. If you've ever met someone who has dealt with a medical condition that doesn't allow them to eat, you suddenly begin to appreciate on a deeper level what this is all about. If you've had friends who've had to deal with stomach feeding tubes and describe those experiences to you, you begin to think about how profound and wonderful and amazing God made us and what he gives to us. I mean, what if everything that we needed was already there and we just forgot the source? We just forgot the giver. We get so wrapped up with the gift and thinking we need more and more and more. Energy. I was thinking about the sun that God created and how much energy the sun has. Now, scientists can correct me about this, but I'm pretty sure that the sun is losing energy. It's not a constant. At some point, it's dissipating. Now, again, you can correct me as a scientist. That I'm very humble about my scientific facts. But the sun is incredible to me that I can feel it and that it can make that much of an impact. Is it 93 million miles away? Something crazy about that? Is that about right? Light years, something? It's a long ways away. And I can feel the impact of that. In fact, I was just so consumed thinking about the energy of the sun. I stayed up all night just thinking about the energy of the sun, and suddenly it dawned on me. I had a similar experience last winter when I was in the dense fog, and you know, I was worried. I was driving my car, and I was afraid that my car was going to run into the fog, but don't worry, it missed. There you go. Ken did not give up bad jokes for Lent. 2, recognize the source of our life. I mean, that's what this is all about, right? Jesus saying, I am truly the bread of life. Deuteronomy 8:3, you know, Jesus references, because they ask him about it, the manna that comes down from heaven that's referenced in the Old Testament. Fascinating stuff. But God humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna. Has a lot to say about our relationship with Jesus being daily, and that we need to come to him daily for our life. He did this to help you realize that real life comes by obeying every command of God. We live for so much more. We're made to live for so much more. He let us go hungry. Have you ever had that experience? Of being uncertain about something? Have you noticed that God's a lot more interested in our character than our comfort? He doesn't always answer our prayers. Lord, I need more bread. You're looking in the wrong place. You don't understand. Jesus said to them in John 6, verse 53, and of course this has tie-ins to what he would say at the communion table, if we call it that. It's a Passover table in the Old Testament. in the New Testament as Jesus is, anyway, long story. But John 6:53, he says, Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat of the flesh of the Son of Man. See, it gets a lot more specific. Goes a lot longer than what I read to you. It gets very specific about this bread of life. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And I can't help but think all the way back to the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve ate sin into the world. Are you with me? The curse came there. The only undoing of that curse is to take in Jesus. 3, how about this? Stop eating junk food. You can put junk food in quotes if you want. I'm not talking about my particular Lent discipline that's going on in my life right now. But junk food, in terms of the distractions of life, we're just so distracted. And it's no wonder we don't find lasting satisfaction because we replace an honest pursuit of God for our pursuit of just about everything else. Entertainment and performance and possessions, etc., etc., etc. Do not work for the food that spoiled, Jesus said, the temporary stuff, but for food that endures to eternal life. And then this, start gathering and feasting on daily manna. I want you to notice in verse 35 on your outlines, that word comes. It's a verb. Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. It's interesting. John's emphasis is always believing, but he also says there's something we need to do to come to me. So I'm going to invite you to take a few minutes silently before God. We call this time open worship. It may be spent in silence. It may be spent with a word if there's something that needs to be said. If God is prompting you to speak, and you know it's not just a message for you personally, but for all, we encourage your obedience. We're going to take this time in open worship, and I want to invite you to think about that. Are you really hungry for God? It's a simple question. And what are you doing? It's a verb. What are you doing to pursue him in your life right now? I don't always do this. I'm going to do something different with open worship. I'm going to put what we call a query on there. A query is a spiritual question that invites us to reflect on our lives. So it's not an answer, it's a question. Do you cultivate your spiritual growth through prayer and Bible reading and through attendance at meetings for worship and study? And how are you finding your joy in the Lord? Let's take some time just to quiet ourselves before God, trusting that he can speak to us personally and individually. Let's attend to the fact that Christ is present with us.